Have you ever been wandering down the street and you see like a coffee cup of some type, and that you know the brand of that coffee cup? You wonder, does that company, do they track this trash? Like, do they track where it all goes? Does it come back to the recycling plant or the garbage dump? And does that get recycled? How can companies just put out stuff and it not come back to them? Right? Because that's kind of part of the circular economy. Wouldn't it be great if that happened? Well, I think we're leaning towards that in Canada because the Canadian federal government just put out an open call to comment on a plastics registry. So a federal plastics registry that will track the companies and the types of plastics that they produce and how it tracks throughout its lifetime within the marketplace and where it goes after that. That's on a way to regulate plastics better to decrease the plastic pollution that is in Canada or that Canadians produce. So we're going to talk about that on why it's so important on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. This is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean. And I'm telling you, the Canadian government is on the right track to really start tackling the plastic pollution problem that we have, not only in Canada, but worldwide. I mean, you know the problem. We've talked about this a number of times on the podcast. But if you're new to the podcast, one, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you being here. And two, this is a time where we are really focusing on, ocean pollution and ocean plastic pollution. There are little microparticles, nanoparticles, if you will, of plastics that are all over the ocean. It's like a soup. It's in the surface. It's in the depths of the ocean. Plastic has touched every part of the ocean, which is over 70% of our planet. Not a good thing. It's affecting animals. It's affecting the chemistry of the water. It's affecting sort of our health as well. And it's bad. It's gotten to a point where it's really, really bad. We've really let it get out of hand. So different countries are trying to put in place policies and regulations that really make sure that we have control over what plastics we're producing. And this comes from a long line of problems that we've identified in Canada as well as the US and other places of how we are recycling plastics and how we're using plastics. Plastics came into play a long time ago. Companies and brands, they really doubled down on this. It's lighter to ship with products. So just imagine like a pop company like Coca-Cola or Pepsi. Now they use plastics, but when I was a kid, it was all bottles. Everything was a glass bottle, and now it's a plastic bottle. Well, it's lighter to ship, so it's cheaper to ship, and you can ship more for less money. So that's always great for them. It's not necessarily great for us in any kind of way from a health standpoint. The plastics, when you unscrew the plastic, and whether it's a plastic water bottle or anything else, that plastic goes into the drink and we ingest it. Not good for us over the long term. There's also the decomposition of the bottles and so forth. It's just not the best for us. Glass bottles would be better, but they're just really, if you see any kind of drink in a glass bottle, it's usually really expensive because it's rare. You don't really see it that often, and it's a little bit of a novelty for the people like myself who grew up in the 80s and probably before that when glass bottles were popular. Regardless, being able to understand, what happens to plastics over time is really important. And going back to sort of the problem that we identified is plastics being used. Then all of a sudden we think, oh, well, plastics can be recycled. And we're told, like, hey, we can recycle these. So put them in the recycling bin. You'll be able to recycle them. Then we find out, in Canada anyway, that there's like an expose that the plastic water bottles, even in the US, plastic water bottles don't get recycled over and over and over again. Really, they can only be recycled once or twice, and then they just break down. They just can't be melted and brought back together, and that process takes a long time. It's expensive, and so the companies don't always do that. They don't always just recycle those bottles, and so even if we put them in a recycling bin, oftentimes they'll end up in the landfill. So having those plastic water bottles, having those plastic bottles are not necessarily a good thing. Other plastics we discovered are really difficult to break down, and so they're not necessarily recycled. now we have a recycling problem. So where was all our recycling going if it wasn't going to the landfill? A lot of the times we found out in the US and Canada for a while that we were shipping them off to small island developing states, Malaysia, Indonesia, even sending it to China. China was starting to take our plastics, and they started to realize they have a plastic problem. A report comes out, 80% of the plastics come through rivers in Asia. I think it was like 5 rivers in Asia. Obviously that's a problem. Everybody's blaming Asian countries, but then all of a sudden we're like, hold on a second here. Even though they may not have the best waste management sort of system, they take a lot of our recycling, the recycling that we can't recycle, and we send to them, and we pay them to take that recycling. Well, all of a sudden, these small island states and these Asian countries are like, well, you have to give it to us in a better form. You can't just give it to us dirty like this, because then we can't do anything with. Now we're getting blamed for putting all these plastics into, the rivers and the oceans. So you have to do, the U.S. and Canada and other countries, you have to do a better job in giving it to us in that type of form. Then all of a sudden, those shipments stopped. So Canada comes out and is like, we got to do something about this plastic pollution. In 2018, Canada starts to say, we're going to ban certain plastics. We're going to have a ban on single-use plastics. And they'll ban like straws, utensils, coffee stir sticks, and so forth, where they can't be used. And that went into play in 2022. It was a bit delayed due to the pandemic, but in 2022, they're starting to have a phase-in process of that. And the reason they were able to do that in Canada was because they put under the Canadian Environment Protection Act, that they are able to list plastics as a toxin. So as toxic. So all plastics are toxic. So from that basis, they can say, we need to regulate plastics because they're toxic. So the first tool that they have, the first weapon, was these 6 items that are banned from being in use, and that'll be phased in. You can't export them, you can't import them, you can't make them in Canada. That's going to happen in a certain number of years where all those bans are going to be put into place. Okay, great, that's awesome. Bit of a setback. In November of this year, I believe, there was a court ruling saying that plastics are not all toxic. So you can't say that plastics are toxic. So that was a Supreme Court ruling or a court ruling. The government's going to appeal that ruling, but at this point, that's the ruling. However, the ban still stays in place. Now what the government is doing is they are going to be putting together a federal plastics registry, which would require companies to track and report their plastic production. That's going to be on its way, and the average Canadian is allowed to weigh in, which is great. We'll talk about that in a second. And we talked about conservation. So now we have this plastic registry, federal plastics registry, which essentially each company is going to have to talk about and record how much plastics they produce. Right? These are going to be the plastic producers. So how much plastics they produce, and where is it going within the system, and how is it coming back? A lot of times, I mentioned the coffee cup thing at the beginning of this show. And because it's been a point of contention for a lot of people. Here in Ontario, we have a coffee shop. It's not Dunkin' Donuts. We have a coffee shop called Tim Hortons. It's a chain. It's very, very popular. Tim Hortons was a Maple Leaf hockey player. Started Tim Hortons off, in Ontario, small couple of shops, couple of coffee shops, and then now it's like worldwide. I think we even have one in Dubai and in Buffalo and all over the place, right? Not that Buffalo is so exotic, but you know what I'm trying to say. But that's a big thing, and so we have people who use Tim Hortons all the time. We see Tim Hortons coffee cups in a ditch, on the grass, on the ground. People are throwing them away, or they blow away from garbage day and so forth. And so we're starting to see all these coffee cups everywhere. And people are wondering, well, shouldn't Tim Hortons, the company, be responsible for, what happens to those coffee cups, even though, they're selling it to people and people should be responsible? Shouldn't those companies be responsible? And that's what this federal plastics registry is trying to do. They're trying to make companies responsible for their plastics. In other words, imagine if a company can make, can have a process where they actually ask for their trash back so that they can put it away, or that they can, dispose of them in the proper way, or maybe even recycle them in the proper way. Wouldn't that be great? I'm not saying that this registry is turning towards that, but it's definitely a step in the right direction of just tracking it and monitoring where this plastic goes, what its life cycle is, and where it ends up. Can they be tracked? Or is there going to be a lot of missing information? Where does that missing information go? Where are the products, the plastic products that are produced by specific companies, if they can't record them back, where does it go at the end of its life, at the end of its use? Not necessarily at the end of its life, at the end of its use. Does it get into the ocean? Does it get into the Great Lakes or any other kind of lake? Does it get into the river systems? That's what this registry is really all about. And Stephen Guilbeault, who's the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, says Canadians are demanding action to tackle plastic waste and pollution crisis, the plastic waste and pollution crisis, and the federal government will continue to act. So it's continuing to put on these different registries or these different like these different things. And so he goes on to say the Federal Plastics Registry is an important tool that will help track and manage plastics across the economy. It will support provinces and territories in making producers responsible for their plastic waste at the end of life and help move Canada toward a circular economy for plastics. Now just imagine that. A circular economy for plastics. Canada has a promise by 2030 that we will be a net zero on plastics. So that's a big, big thing. Right. But I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the, stats around plastics that we have to work on. This is why it's so important. According to a release that was put out recently, Canadians threw away 4.4 million tons of plastic waste in 2019, with only 9% of going on to be recycled. More than 90% of plastic waste in Canada ends up in landfills, incinerators, or directly in the natural environment. This is according to the Environmental Defence and the Canadian Environmental Law Association. Landfills account for 23% of Canada's methane emissions. So we're not saying that the plastics in the landfills, cause the 23% of Canada's methane emissions. However, we know what they're made from, right? We know what plastics are made from. They're petroleum products. And so as they dispose and as they break down, you're going to see those gases, those chemicals really leak into the atmosphere, and that's not a good thing. So, knowing that plastic has a huge part on the environment, it's important that we start tracking this. Obviously, this is not going to necessarily ban outright plastics, but it will definitely provide Canadians and the Canadian government with a way to track this. Right, that's going to be a really, something in the future that we're really going to need. So the registry is set to unfold in phases, with some sectors such as packaging and electrical equipment required to put together reports on their plastic production for others like agriculture and textiles. So, some will come out in first, some will come out at different times. Currently, the first phase of reporting isn't set to begin until June 2025. So not this year, but another year and a half, say, that we will have to have that go together. But the registry will gather information on plastics placed on the market, followed by plastics collected for diversion, plastics that are reused, remanufactured, or repaired, and those that are recycled and recovered for energy. So according to the January release that the government has put out, the registry would also make this information accessible to Canadians and businesses through a publicly accessible platform. So it'll be accessed. So a lot of people are going to be able to find it and be like, hey, this company produces a lot and they don't account for a lot. So there's going to be a lot of pressure on companies that produce these types of plastics to be accountable for the plastics that they put out and that they should be retrieving, that they shouldn't have to, that Canadians shouldn't have to deal with this plastic. It should be the companies. Now, what that's going to do from an economic perspective that is a mystery to me. I can see this costing a lot for the companies, and they might actually increase their prices, which may make plastic not really worthwhile after a while. Who knows what it's going to do? But I would love to hear from you. What do you think this plastic registry is going to do? Do you think it's an important part of trying to take account of how many different types of plastics are in the market? I think it'll really show the public, all these different types of plastics and what they can do to the environment. The consequences of disposing them in landfills instead of recycling them and then breaking down, or even in the waters and in our environment. This could be a really important registry. It could be a really great tool for us in the future to be able to put out more regulations and better regulations that might be good for companies as well as Canadian citizens and the environment. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. You can DM me on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. Is this something that Canadians should have? Is this something that where you live in your country, this should have, like the US, the UK, Australia, India, Brazil, wherever you live? Is this something that you should be discussing? Is this something that your country should be tracking as well? If not, let me know. Love to hear from you at How to Protect the Ocean, all one word, on Instagram. DM me. You can also get a hold of me by going to speakupforblue.com/contact. Just fill out the form. That email goes right to me, and would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your voice as well. So if you want to leave me a voicemail, you can do that. Just go in the bottom right hand corner at speakupforblue.com, click on the microphone, send me a voice message, and I will respond. So thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.